I'll now introduce our next session, focused on the topic of consolidation. A panel discussion will be taking place with leading industry experts from the region and globally. I'd like now to welcome our moderator for the session, Mr. Richard Sleeb, President of NexantECA. Richard has over 45 years of experience in energy and chemical industry, where he has supported opportunities around the globe, providing strategic, technical, and commercial advice, mergers and acquisitions, projects, finance support. Richard is deeply committed to assisting the industry in its transition to become more sustainable for the future. Mr. Richard, welcome on stage.
Thank you, Miriam. Good morning, and my thanks to the City of Doha, to GPCA for inviting this panel to discuss the role of M&A in achieving transformation in the chemical industry in these uncertain times. In my more than 40 years in the industry, it's always been uncertain times. However, I think this time, the fundamental shift in focus towards the greater protection of the planet's atmosphere is probably a bigger challenge than any previous shift, and it requires all of the ingenuity of the chemical industry just as much as the previous developments of polymers, smart materials, and the innovation to create the wonderful products that petrochemicals give to life on the planet over the last 40 years. So we've always got uncertainty, but one of the means of achieving the kind of change that we want to achieve to reduce the impact of producing these wonderful materials is the toolbox that the industry has of mergers and acquisitions. It can be a faster route to transformation than building new facilities. It can help meet expansion strategies and allow consolidation. But it's certainly no less stressful a route. So the market is evolving. We have greater forces of change. On the demand side, we have the moral, the stakeholders, and the end market pressure for more sustainable practices and products. We also have added regulatory compliance and reporting pressure to deter carbon-intensive processes and to encourage green practices. And so what are the mechanisms that can be used in order to achieve the kind of outcome that we would like to see? Well, firstly, we can retrofit existing assets. So that includes carbon capture, renewable Scope 2 supply, as well as adding in additional features to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, the development and investment in green chemicals based on renewable power and sustainable water. These technologies are not novel, but they've never been built at the scale required to move the needle on the sustainability chemicals indicator. And then one which is really related to mergers and acquisitions is asset optimization. And that can mean phasing out of older assets that cannot be transformed, but also using mergers and acquisitions to find a more sustainable ownership for others. So, industry consolidation, it's not new. It's been going on since the 1980s, 1990s. And I remember back then, particularly in the 1990s, the consolidation of the oil and chemical companies was something which was really quite radical, particularly in the developed markets of Europe, Americas, and Japan. And the business went through a series of very large consolidating mergers to radically change the environment, with merged entities gaining size and reducing operating costs. And these were focused on having more competitive advantage, reducing corporate costs, synergies, consolidating markets. And this was I'd like to take one example here, and the chart here shows polyethylene. So we're looking at high-density and linear low-density polyethylene from 1990 to today. In 1990, the global capacity was about 19 million tons per year. The top 10 producers and sellers owned less than half of the total capacity. That top 10 included Exxon, separately, Mobil. It included Dow, Union Carbide. Exxon and Mobil then merged their oil companies, and the chemical companies followed. And their merged capacity share in polyethylene took each of them, which had been about 3%, to a combined 10% after some further expansion. Similarly, Dow acquired Union Carbide. LyondellBasell was formed from a string of mergers, including BASF, Shell, Montel, Hoechst, and others. And these consolidations, although they had an impact on the top 10 producers, they each became bigger, that would, you'd think, consolidate the market. Well, actually it didn't. And the reason it didn't is because there were new entrants. So in addition to consolidation amongst the players, and this is relevant to consolidation we can see today, in addition to consolidation amongst the players, the new entrants, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, added more new capacity such that the overall market share of the top 10 remained below 50%, and it continues below 50%. And this is an example for polyethylene. But actually, if we take an example of monoethylene glycol, ME Global consolidating and reduced or increased the share of the top 10, and then SABIC coming in as a new entrant really reduced that again. So I think the conclusion here is that there is industry consolidation, but there will simultaneously be expansion such that there is not necessarily in the big commodity markets an overall leader in the markets. Now, some of the smaller markets, there can be a leader, and that can help consolidation and return to profitability. Okay, so we're not sure there is consolidation. What about the mergers and acquisitions and the current state of the M&A market? And here, I'm analyzing the number of M&A deals in Europe, Middle East, and Africa over the last 10 years by quarter. And you can see there's quite a variation on the number of deals done quarter by quarter, but actually the total number is between 50 and 100 per quarter. Now, many of these are very small deals, but there's a lot of M&A activity. So there may not be the big mega mergers that we saw in the 1990s, but there are a lot of deals happening. And then in the late 2010s, in 17, 18, started to see some of the chemical industry big mergers, Dow and DuPont, Monsanto and Bayer, etc. And then in the Middle East, starting to see more mergers and consolidation, culminating in the largest, the acquisition of Saudi Aramco's, SABIC's shares by Saudi Aramco. And the orange line here shows the proportion of Middle Eastern deals in that total of EMEA number of deals. And we clearly see that's actually been increasing since 2020. So there's actually, in this region, there's actually a trend towards more activity in the M&A field. So what are the strategies that are available to achieve lower carbon in this very complex sector of the chemical industry? And on the right, there's a graphic which you can't see, so it just shows complexity. Simply, there are a number of strategies that can be undertaken. The first is that producers are rightly investing in lower carbon production and abatement, including electric furnaces on steam crackers, electrolyzers as the source of green hydrogen, carbon sequestration, etc. And that is extremely important. There's a lot of research going on, and I'm glad to see quite a lot of collaboration in that research and that development. But that's early stage still. Secondly, the industry is actually aiding lower carbon in the manufacturing industry. So producing sustainable materials produced by the chemical industry for use in manufacturing to allow manufacturing to reduce its carbon footprint. And this is a really effective solution for the planet. But talk to the regulators, particularly in Europe, and they're not interested in the chemical industry's ability to reduce carbon emissions in downstream manufacturing. There, the impact is, what are you doing? What are you doing in your industry? So although it's something that we should continue to do, it's not something we're necessarily going to get very much credit for. And then the next one, collaboration. And this is collaboration between chemical producers, manufacturing, post-consumer materials collection, reducing waste and achieving circular economy. And the previous session discussed this in some detail. And this has already generated M&A activity. So we've got polymer producers investing downstream with the production of post-plastic feedstocks for virgin polymer production. And that collaboration across sectors is an important strategy in order to achieve lower carbon emissions in the complex sector. And then the one with immediate corporate impact is divest high carbon intensity assets to other owners who are better able to manage the emissions problem. So portfolio carbon reduction there. However, can M&A or investors deal with new technologies for low carbon production, which are yet to be proven at scale, and those that are required to decarbonize? And this comes down to risk appetite, and we'll explore this in the panel session. So the risk appetite for venture capital, for private equity, as well as for corporates from balance sheets and from the more traditional capital markets, can they really step up and provide the level of capital that's required? So I think there are a number of M&A strategies, a number of M&A ways of evolving the chemical landscape. And that M&A toolbox contains several different traditional routes, such as portfolio extension, access to technology, and that remains valid. That's a good reason for acquiring other people's businesses. Although in this case, actually, the technology has to be shared. We have to be able to understand the secrets of scaling up in green chemicals and production, and that requires a bit of a change of thinking. Certainly, M&A can provide de-risking of the supply chains by M&A upstream and downstream, including the post-consumer recycling, and that's definitely a valid M&A strategy. And then the more radical one of green surgery, as I'm defining it, an M&A strategy to lower corporate emissions, but it doesn't actually lower the planet's emissions. And one warning, any surgery is a risk to the patient. So I think the M&A environment is ripe. There's plenty of M&A deals going on. There are plenty of strategies to consolidate the industry and to help move towards a more environmentally friendly, a lower carbon emissions industry. And we've assembled a panel of experts who are going to bring their considerable experience to the trends in M&A markets and the growing ESG requirements on investments. So we've got three panelists. I'd like to introduce them, and then we'll welcome them to the stage. So firstly, I'd like to welcome Nadia Al Hajji, CEO of PIC Petrochemicals Industries in Kuwait, which was, and she'll be the first to say, the first petrochemical company in the Gulf and the leading petrochemical arm of Kuwait. Nadia is also the chairperson of a Kuwait petrochemical company and one of the many joint ventures set up by PIC. She's a chemical engineer who spent the majority of her career in refining before taking up her previous role at PIC, heading M&A projects and joint venture monitoring. Secondly, Tom Crotty. Tom's the Corporate Affairs Director of Ineos Group based in the UK. Ineos is celebrating its 25th anniversary. It doesn't seem a day, but 25th anniversary this year. And it's grown from a single site in 1998 to one of the world's largest petrochemical companies with a turnover of $65 billion, 194 sites across 29 countries. In recent years, the group's expanded into energy, automotive, and consumer brands, which is interesting, as well as building a growing high-performance sports portfolio. Paul Smith, Managing Director and Global Head of Chemicals at Citi. He's a regular attendee and participant here at GPCA, and in his over 30-year career in investment banking, has advised on some of the largest deals in the chemical sector. His clients include many of the world's leading chemical companies, and he's based out of Citi's headquarters in New York. Please welcome the panelists to the stage. Welcome. So, firstly, let's consider the industry consolidation and whether this has actually been a primary driver of M&A. So, maybe I can start with you, Nadia. So, how does M&A feature in achieving your long-term strategy for petrochemicals? And do you kind of consider the overall market structure and concentration when you consider acquisitions and mergers?
Morning, everyone. Essentially, our strategy at PIC involves both projects, whether it's grassroots or greenfield, brownfield, or acquisitions and M&As. More recently, I think the mergers and acquisitions have become a more focused part of the strategy. For various reasons, we've had a little bit of delays in certain projects, and so more and more we see that the acquisitions become a sort of bridge to bridge some of the delays on some of the projects. Mm-hmm. And so we see a lot more focus on the mergers and acquisitions, but it's very much a key fundamental part of the strategy. In our growth plans that are built into the strategy, there is sort of a keen focus to not acquire 100% of businesses or assets. So we do like to partner. When we say acquisitions or mergers, we do like to work in partnerships. So bring to the table the strengths that both partners can bring together. So it's very much focused on win-win. I don't think win-lose will ever get anywhere. So that's a key area of focus when we look at our growth plans and our strategies. Those are very much linked to the strategic growth in core chemicals and specialties and derivatives linked to those core chemicals. But it is a fundamentally part of the plan going forward.
So you have to do both M&A as well as investing directly?
Yes.
Neither of them are easy.
Yeah, especially recently.
Yes, indeed. Tom, I'd describe Ineos as the ultimate consolidator or acquirer. You've gobbled up so much of the industry over 25 years. I think I count 50 acquisitions and 19 disposals so far. So what criteria do you apply to select the potential acquisition targets? And is consolidation actually part of that decision-making process?
I don't think consolidation is a direct part of the process for us. And our approach has changed over that 25 years. I mean, we started out as a very small company being very opportunistic. Yeah. In the early noughties, there was a lot of opportunity around, particularly where you had the oil majors wanting to divest what they saw as their bulk petrochemical assets. And we saw our ability to run those assets as being a strength that was worth exploiting. So it was more about opportunism, what was available, and could we make a go of it. That then changes into a position where you have a presence in certain sectors, ethylene oxide, ethylene, polyethylene, where you're actively seeking, I suppose you could classify them as consolidation opportunities, but we'd see them as growth opportunities for us, where we can exploit the expertise that we've then grown on a bigger scale. So that's what's changed, I think, over time, from opportunism to consolidation and potential growth in certain sectors.
Yep. And it's certainly been effective.
Hopefully, yeah. I think so.
Paul, Citigroup, one of the biggest investment banks in the chemicals M&A market. Do you believe that the market is evolving to consolidate, or is it about individual company strategies really driving that activity?
So maybe I'll comment a little bit on some of the points you made earlier as well, Richard.
Please.
I think we did see consolidation in the petrochemical industry, the oil and gas industry, as you described in the 1990s. And while we haven't seen as much in that sector in the last, say, 20 years, we've seen a massive consolidation in other subsectors of the chemical industry. I would include industrial gases and agrochemicals as two industries that went from 6 or 7 players to 3 or 4 players. And so what is it that, when we go and talk to our large clients in the petrochemical industry, what's stopping it from maybe happening in the last decade or so? I think, one, there hasn't been a big imperative to consolidate. People have been making money. You had the shale gas advantage that emerged in the U.S.
Right.
for the U.S. Gulf Coast players. Obviously, the Middle East has maintained a significant advantage. So there hasn't been this sort of existential issue causing people to say, we got to save money, we got to consolidate, we got to rationalize. In petrochemicals, that may change in the future. Secondly is regulatory. The environment and regulatory has changed quite a bit, making it much more challenging to do integrations and consolidation. I think the regulators, certainly in the U.S., but also in Europe and elsewhere, have scrutinized deals a lot more, making it more challenging, drawing out the timelines. And the implication of regulation is that if a big petrochemical company considers a consolidation, they have to count on some dyssynergy. In other words, they're going to need to sell some things, and probably not at prices they'd really want. And then the third thing that I think is also important is there's much more of a focus on the downsides and the risk factors in M&A than before. So in other words, every company in the chemical industry and the oil and gas industry has their own issues that they're dealing with, right? They may be carbon emissions and sustainability issues. They may be sort of structurally disadvantaged assets, but they're dealing with them, and they consume quite a bit of time and effort. When they look at counterparties, there's an increased focus, I would say, on the issues that those companies are facing. And do I really want to do a big splashy merger and now have compounding issues or having to deal with somebody else's issues? So we see our clients much more interested in doing kind of narrow focused acquisitions and avoiding downside problems, I would say.
That's interesting, because that's it's saying that the industry is becoming more conservative, possibly because of regulation and requirements. But actually, this industry is about innovation. But from a corporate M&A perspective, you're saying that actually people are getting more conservative rather than more radical in their thinking.
Tom, you want to? I think they're following the guidance of investors. And investors want to see more focus, want to see, they don't want to deal with large problems that require significant capital to abate carbon, for example. And so I think the CEOs that I talk to are very much echoing what they're hearing from their investors and in their boardrooms in terms of where to focus, which actually drives them more to organic growth in today's market than M&A growth in some ways.
I think Paul makes a really good point about regulators in this issue. One of the big challenges with consolidation deals is the regulatory hurdles are extremely high. And inevitably, as you say, involves pain. Certainly when we've been through at a product level, certain deals around consolidation, things like PVC consolidation in Europe, the regulatory approvals for those deals took probably 2 years and involved some fairly painful disposals along the way. I was surprised when you mentioned our 19 disposals. I couldn't work out what they were. I now remember that a lot of them are to do with that. So it is a real challenge. Consolidation is a challenge.
Yeah. And that's something that's really changed over the last 25 years of your experience, that the regulatory requirements and hurdles are greater. And surely that's something that puts you off going through the process, because it's just become so expensive. To even get there, 2 years is a very long time to be looking at a potential deal.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. But I suppose, you know, it's always this thing with anything you do in business: is the gain worth the pain? And if the gain is sufficient, then you take the pain.
And you go for it, right? Yeah. So Nadia, in your acquisitions and joint ventures, so from the buyer's perspective, is it strategic fit rather than looking at undervalued assets?
Maybe just following up on some of the points that were just made as well. I think first and foremost, it's got to make money.
Yes.
Right? So some of the volatility that we're just talking about, whether it's on price volatility, bringing in certain uncertainties, issues like the cost of money and how that plays into what's going on right now. I think from our perspective, the drivers haven't changed. They remain to be able to make money. The uncertainty has come in because of those factors that we've recently seen come into play. But from our perspective, it has to pass strategic fit before it's even looked at. But having said that, if it doesn't make money, there's no point in looking at it anyway. So I think that's one of the major driver right now. I think what we're seeing recently is a sort of gap in expectation between buyer and seller that's kind of stalling a lot of deals that might have been easier to conduct. So I think when you say undervalued assets, I think unless it's a company that's actually about to fall off, the treadmill, I think they either hold on as long as they can, and it's going to remain a gap between buyer-seller that stalls some of these major deals. I think we're really living in interesting times. So 2024, if it's going to be a repeat of this year, I think is going to be the test of time as to whether or not we see any real opportunities come to fruition through the year ahead.
So there are no undervalued assets because the seller isn't prepared to sell them at a discount anymore, whereas previously perhaps that's how you could sweep up a lot of the vinyls or the styrenics market.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's no question that certainly 20 years ago, value was there. Value is in the eye of the beholder, of course. And from our point of view, if you could buy a business for 30 or 40 cents in the dollar, that's a good deal. From the seller's point of view, it's a good deal because they're a publicly quoted company getting out of what was seen as an unwanted commodity, and their reward was in a share price improvement. So, everybody wins. So it's about your perception of value.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a recent study by Accenture which said that investor exit was one of the key drivers for sellers' motivation. Followed by synergy, portfolio optimization, and, as you say, the effect on the share price. Whereas divesting an underperforming asset is relatively low in that survey. And so, from a seller's perspective, Paul, you're advising a big advisor to vendors. What do you find that their most frequent drivers? And also, from an investment bank's perspective, what is it that you have to shape in the seller as a vendor advisor to make the asset attractive?
Yeah. So I'll give you just one statistic to start it off, as I think it responds a bit to what Nadia and Tom were talking about. In our practice over the last 18 months or so, of all the deals that we've worked on proactively, actually done real work on, only about 30% of them have actually transacted. And that may not be with our buyers, it may be with somebody else, but 30% transacted, 70% no deal.
Okay.
So I think we've been in an environment where there's evident challenges, in the world, destocking, high interest rates, and an uncertain future for the economic outlook has been quite cloudy for some time, and that's really made it difficult for buyers and sellers to meet. And so, there's quite a few deals that just you may not read about because they're not getting done. I think in terms of your question about what's driving the divestitures for the sellers, first of all, the first one you said, which is the most prominent, is investors seeking liquidity or whatever that was. That's private equity, right? Because private equity still comprises probably 40, maybe higher percentage of the overall chemicals investment banking activity. And those owners, by definition, are going to be sellers, probably in a 3 to 5 year time frame. So investors seeking an exit is really a code, I'd say, for private equity. As to the rest, the strategic guys who are selling assets, I still think the number one reason people are exiting assets is because they're simply not currently or likely in the future to meet their return criteria. They just don't belong in the portfolio anymore. And that may be compounded or the underlying reason is that the company just isn't well positioned in the industry. They may be the number 5, 6, or 7 player, and the profits are going to the number 1 and 2 players, right? So they're saying, look, we can't change the game. We unlikely to improve returns. There may be an element of like additional capital required in the future, could be carbon abatement related or otherwise that's necessary, and they're deciding to exit because it's non-core for all those reasons. And we see, and this has been going on all through my career. I would say in North America, there was a lot more of it earlier, and by and large, my North American clients, I think they're still refining the portfolio, but the big moves in terms of portfolio optimization are more behind us than ahead of us. In Europe, I think it's the opposite. I think there's probably more portfolio optimization to happen in Europe ahead than we've done in the last, say, couple of decades.
Yeah. Tom, I was going to ask you about exits, but you've kind of answered that they're forced upon you by regulators to a certain extent.
Not all. We have had one or two, picking up on Paul's point, where we've taken a view that we have a business that doesn't fit with the broader portfolio and would be better owned by someone else where there was a better portfolio fit. So we have made one or two divestments of that sort. Right. But we're not a venture capitalist, so we don't buy for exit. We buy for retention. So.
Actually, that fits, Nadia, with your comments about a win-win asset, whereas maybe venture capital and particularly private equity, they're just a win. Yeah. Okay, let's turn our attention to M&A in the Middle East and consolidation in the Middle East. We saw in the introduction that actually the number of deals is increasing that include Middle East companies and assets. And historically, consolidation in the region has been more in-country mergers and reorganizations rather than cross-border reorganization. And of course, the Middle East retains national energy companies as the main ownership structure, although alongside a growing private sector. So in PIC, you've been successful in petrochemical joint ventures and completed several acquisitions, consolidating into global players. So your observations on the attractiveness of investing in the region, and do you see appetite for cross-border consolidation and mergers within the Middle East, or are national interests going to prevent this?
Short or long answer?
Long answer. Deep insight.
No, I think you talked about national interests. I think for the majority of it, those national interests will prevail. It would be an ideal world if we could somehow imagine the region kind of splitting on asset-based or on commodity-based sort of chemicals, and have certain countries focus on certain chemicals and have that kind of a collaboration. I know kind of it feels like euphoria or wishful thinking, but I think the region has its national agendas, especially when you take this upper level to the mother organizations. Having said that, I mean, we've got examples of working well together, you know, some strong strategic partnerships that serve all the national agendas. You know, we've got, especially with Kuwait, Saudi, and Oman, and Bahrain, are strong examples of working together. On an upstream perspective, I think Kuwait and Saudi do have like a cross-border shared national production facility. So it does work, but in terms, I think the consolidation that you're talking about, I don't see happening in the immediate future.
So you can achieve it through strategic alliances rather than formal mergers?
Yes. But I think, coming back to your other point about the region and its attractiveness for investment, I think the region will remain one of the lowest carbon ton of petrochemicals and oil and gas. So in that sense, I think this region will be the ultimate winner in this game, simply because of its ability to be the most efficient barrel or ton of production, the most or least carbon intensive production facilities that I think in the end will be the winner.
Certainly the newer assets and the newer investments, partly because of their scale, but partly because of their advanced technologies, are very efficient. But there's also quite a lot of assets from the 80s and 90s when actually energy efficiency wasn't that important in the region because energy was so cheap. The rest of the world had to do a lot of energy reduction.
There is another perspective to that, even though it might not have been fashionable elsewhere. I think in the region, because of the somewhat deep pockets back, and when they were going for those assets, it was always best in class. Those assets never stayed as they were. I mean, if we talk about energy conservation, it's not new. I mean, it might be termed or coined as a new term from the financiers as ESG and all of that. These are not new initiatives, and we've been doing them for decades. And I think the region has been one of the first to invest in all of those initiatives, maybe because we could afford to do so, or because it was best in class at the time. So I think even the older assets have not remained stagnant, and as they were when they were first built, they were continually improved for energy efficiency. And I think it's very important to say that it made economic sense to do so. So there was a lot of investment that was put into ensuring the emissions were as low as they could possibly be by best available technology at the time.
Right.
And that made perfect economic sense. And I think that's where the struggle right now is, because any initiative that you put forward in terms of capital investments today for what's perceived to be a possible premium that you might get down the road isn't going to pass anybody's board approval, at least ours, I can tell you for sure. It has to make economic sense. Otherwise, you're not going to hit that win-win, right? It's just not sustainable. Even in areas like in North America, where you see incentives from governments, I think even that, to a certain degree, is not sustainable. In my opinion, at the end, somebody's going to have to pay for this. And there's, again, a gap between having an investment decision today for a possible penalty or premium that you might see down the line is a time lag that we haven't figured out how to address today. So I think we're struggling.
Yeah, and any government incentives can disappear.
Yep, a premium won't stay a premium forever, will it?
No. Paul, taking a view of the Middle East and particularly some of the larger M&A activities in the region that have been prominent in Saudi Arabia, consolidation in UAE. Would you anticipate from an outsider's perspective cross-border mergers, or is it going to be strategic alliances? And does this kind of need to change in order to make regional even bigger mega players?
Yep. So I would start with an observation that our business, our advisory business in the Middle East in chemicals has picked up dramatically over the last decade. I think the companies here were quietly doing their businesses, I would say, for many years, and very successfully with good technology, with good stewardship, with low-cost feedstocks, and a great opportunity to diversify economies, right? So that was the theme, I think, for a long time. More in the last decade, I feel like the companies here have developed a much better and more robust global view of the market, and they want to expand. And I think they're getting encouragement from governments and national policymakers, as well as the oil and gas companies, who see an imperative, right, to pivot to a certain extent away from lower growth end markets for oil and gas, like fossil, like fuel, into polymers, which are going to continue to grow well into the future. And so that pivot, I think, has happened, and it's made chemicals and polymers a much more important place to invest. And so that's where we see, like, the pickup in activity in our practice is less about interregional consolidation. That hasn't been a big theme. It's more about outbound investment. And I'd say the biggest nexus of that would be Middle East into Asia. There's just a lot of interest in that, and there's a perfect marriage there of the capabilities and advantages that you have in the Middle East and the large and growing markets of Asia. So we see that nexus as really very active, and there's other elements to it, but we just see these companies in your region, and thank you for using our services, but we see them as much more active on the global scene in consolidation and acquisitions in chemicals.
Yes, we'll turn to more discussion into regional activities shortly, but before we leave the Middle East, Tom, I know Ineos has considered several investments in the past, and you're probably evaluating some current opportunities. You kind of shied away from them. What don't you like about the Middle East?
Nothing. I mean,
Yes, Tom, exactly.
we have actually got a couple of big projects going on in Saudi at the moment, so we are starting to develop. I mean, it's a dint of history. I mean, it's the way we've grown. We've grown through acquisition, and we happen to have acquired companies that haven't really had a position in the Middle East. So it's not been a deliberate policy in any way, and it's not for want of trying over recent years. But we are correcting that now. I think the interesting point, listening to what Nadia said and also what Paul said around the consolidation issue, just going back to that for a moment, because there's a link. Paul mentioned that the US has managed to do a lot of very successful consolidation, but Europe has not, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think that has been due to the national issues. The US is one place, it's one nation. It's much easier to do big consolidations.
Have you convinced Texas of that?
Yeah, I think Texas has reluctantly joined the union. Okay. But no, I think the point Nadia made about and your questions asked about national issues, yep, that does impede probably the regional consolidation that needs to be done.
That's interesting in the regional consolidation, and although we're talking about the Middle East, UK's exit from Brexit must have had an impact on Ineos. I know you were vocal about it.
Yes, yeah, not helpful, I don't think, in any way.
No, okay, well, moving swiftly on. You mentioned interregional activity and the activity between the Middle East and Asia. And similarly, Asian companies have been targeting European assets and European assets. And similarly, Middle Eastern producers have been expanding into and targeting US and European assets for a long time. So is that what are the drivers behind those cross-regional buys? Is it because the regional plays have been completed and you have to go cross-border for that? So Paul, what do you see as the driver, particularly for sort of Asian investment in Asian investment in North America and Europe?
So I think it's, we've had Petronas do a deal, PTT do a deal. These are large oil and gas companies, right, with chemical businesses. But what they're doing is they're going downstream. They're going into specialties. And why does it make sense to do it there and less so here? Well, it's quite simple. They don't have a feedstock advantage that they can leverage in Asia generally, right? So taking a more value-added strategy is important. And developing businesses that really are value-add that they can nurture and invest in back in their home market is the right thing to do. I think in the Middle East, it's been less of a push into specialties because of this inherent advantage we have here in the Middle East in producing petrochemicals. But so I think it's mostly about diversification and moving downstream in the case of those a couple of examples. And we see ongoing interest from Asian clients in those kind of acquisitions.
I think the other key point for investing in other regions is feedstock advantage is one thing, but you need a market. And one of the attractions with Europe is it's a big market, however you cut it. It's a big, wealthy market with people who can afford to spend money. And that is one of the main reasons why you've got people wanting to invest in European assets.
Yeah, market access has always been one of the drivers, as has access to technology as a key driver. Yeah. So you actually have to have some assets within that region, and potentially with things like carbon border adjustment mechanism, this can heighten people's awareness of how they're going to trade with the European Union, particularly, and other areas of the world where this could be an impact. Yeah. So looking at sticking with interregional activity, PIC's invested in joint ventures, particularly South Korea and Vietnam. So what were the drivers behind making acquisitions and investments in Asia? And do you see that as more attractive than for Europe or the United States?
Not necessarily so. Obviously, we do target areas that are close to market, so that's one of the key drivers that we consider when we're looking at whether it's new projects or acquisitions. But the States is definitely, or more specifically North America, so Canada and the States, are definitely focus areas for us as well because of the advantage feedstocks. Our most recent project, which was done in Texas, in Oyster Creek, under ME Global, was commissioned in 2019, and it won an award for best project. It took a recognition coming in low budget and schedule. So the US is definitely, US and Canada, or the Americas, are definitely key focus areas for us going forward. Absolutely.
We're also seeing China investing outside its borders and having expansion plans. Is that a threat at all, maybe?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear. You asked whether China...
Is China's more acquisitive stance becoming a threat elsewhere?
So China outbound activity in M&A in our world has decreased a lot. They were routinely on the buyer's list, right, 5 and 10 years ago, and a likely buyer of many assets, and today it's just not the case. I think geopolitics has a lot to do with that. Where they are a threat is in their drive to self-sustainability in a lot of these basic products. And I think the biggest issue facing the chemical industry writ large today is this sort of dual impact of China's slowing down in terms of demand growth, while adding a lot of supply, specifically in our industry over the last 3 or 4 years, in a relatively undisciplined fashion, to be blunt. So I think that's a big existential issue for the industry that's sort of compounding some of the demand weakness we're seeing because of the relative weakness of the other economies.
I mean, I think China's fascinating because going back to what we were saying about where are the advantages in the different regions, China's big advantage has been it's a huge market, but not only that, it's becoming the supplier to the world of many, many products. And therefore, never mind their own people and their growing purchasing power, they are supplying the rest of the world. So that's where our industry needs to supply them. On the downside, they've always had a feedstock disadvantage and they've always had a technology disadvantage. The latter is improving very, very rapidly. And I think they've used strategic alliances to good effect. We currently have some very major joint venture activity in China. And we're not naive enough to assume it's because they just like us. It's because we've got technology that they really want. And it suits us to grow our business in Asia by exploiting that technology advantage. So I think they're making up that technology deficiency very, very quickly. And the challenge for them is on the feedstock side. But you know, everything they've done around the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of that has been about consolidating upstream in key raw materials, and we're just going to see more of that.
Yes, so in that situation, there's a win-win and market access against technology availability.
Yeah.
Which again has been a theme from the Middle East over the last 20 years in some of the joint ventures. It's worked extremely well. Yeah. Okay, turning to the portfolio reduction and ESG theme, and the theme of this conference, and indeed a major agenda item for every boardroom. So M&A as a means to reducing carbon emissions, is this a valid corporate strategy? Paul, we'll start with you. So, yeah, and also have hydrocarbons and petrochemical assets lost some of their attractiveness because of the greenhouse gas issues?
So it's a complicated and a bit fraught topic. I think there are companies that did M&A deals to sell assets, say 5 years plus ago, who today look back and say, wow, that was a good trade, you know, because I eliminated a big carbon footprint that wasn't really a focus of the transaction at the time, but today it's a benefit. Okay, so I would say in the last 3 to 5 years, it's become a lot more difficult to make those transactions happen because every buyer, private equity, privately owned, or corporate, are highly attuned to their own carbon emissions and how they're going to abate their own. So I think when I talked about that 70-30, certainly some of the deals that fall into that 70% that didn't happen were because the asset just couldn't find a home, right?
Right.
Somebody, a corporation tried to sell it. Maybe it's still a viable business, it's making money, but it has some challenges on the carbon side, and I'm not saying that explains all 70%, but there's certainly that becomes an issue. I think going forward, M&A will continue to be a facilitator, but I do want to say one thing, which is that most of the clients I work with in the chemical industry, you know, these are principled people, and I think everybody on the panel will agree. And they recognize that the problems that they're facing in decarbonization are legacy issues of these companies that may go back decades and even a century. And shifting that burden to someone else who may not be as good a steward is not good for the world, and it's probably not good for them in the long run. So I think there's a recognition that, just M&A for that specific reason is not sufficient, right? It has to be a broader move within the portfolio that just makes business sense, and that the buyer has to be able to shoulder the burden, right? And it has to be sold responsibly.
But we have seen some such deals, particularly in areas like fertilizers, where companies can reduce the carbon, if you like, on their balance sheet, as long as you can find, as you say, a responsible buyer. So if that's the case, is it a valid exit strategy?
Look, I think if the stars align and there's a good business with cash flow and somebody wants to own it and it's a carbon emitting business, but they're going to be a good steward and they're going to deal with it, invest the capital required or whatever in the future, I think that's perfectly valid. I think I'll say another thing, which is that we could use more companies like Ineos, because Ineos has been a really good and responsible consolidator of the industry over the last 25 years. They've done good things for themselves and for others to consolidate various chains of the chemical industry. Mm-hmm. But when I look into the future and I do see a lot of assets that are going to come out of oil and gas companies and chemical companies for carbon reasons, but for other reasons. They're deselecting. Their investors want them to focus on growth. Maybe they want to focus on mobility, but they want to do EV and they want to get out of the internal combustion engine components, whatever, right? And there's, frankly, a lack of buyers for those assets who have a long-term view of ownership. The private equity tend to have this sort of 3 to 5, 6 year time frame. Yep. And they are also, in my view, like very focused on sustainability. Because you have to remember the LP investors who are investing in private equity are exact same people who are the public equity investors in large public companies. And they have the same criteria and they're imposing them, which is their right, on the private equity investors, right? So one of the first things I think any private equity firm has to face when they're taking a business to their investment committee is, what's the sustainability profile of this asset? So it's not like that's going to be the home for all of this.
But is it, you say private equities with a 3 to 4 year turnaround, and the ability to take difficult decisions quickly. So maybe there is a role for private equity to turn some of those assets and make them more attractive again.
I think coming back to your question, does ESG, what's the impact of ESG on these decisions? Mm-hmm. I agree entirely with what Paul said, that in one way ESG has an impact, but it's probably a negative impact on consolidation for the very reasons you've described. But is ESG the answer to solving your ESG problems? I don't think it is, right. Because there are no ready-made solutions you can just go out there and buy. So the attitude we take, and I think Paul's right, we have a huge advantage in being a private company. So we're not answerable to public investors, which obviously quoted companies are, and indeed venture capitalists are, because they rely on those investors who've got increasingly strict investment criteria. So we can ignore that, but what we have to do at the same time is develop our own solutions to carbon. I always avoid the use of the word decarbonisation. And that's just an issue I have as we're in the organic chemistry business. Yes. It's quite hard to get rid of carbon from organic chemistry. What you have to do is remove emissions, and that's a fundamental and subtle difference that certainly the general public don't get, and I suspect a lot of politicians don't understand either. So we have to decarbonise through emissions, not through losing carbon. So I personally think that there are opportunities for a company like ours to acquire assets, and we don't acquire. There's a simple correlation between quality of assets generally and emissions. So the worst emitting assets tend to be the poorest quality, and we wouldn't buy them because they're poor quality.
Yes.
So we buy good quality assets, but we're not too worried about taking on their emissions because we have a process of emission abatement across all our assets that we're quite happy to incorporate.
Yeah, yeah. And Nadia, you've already mentioned that the Middle East assets, you've invested in them through time, so they're already energy efficient. You also have potential opportunities for carbon capture and storage. You have, in this region, there's abundant land, so solar power generation as a means of further reducing emissions in the power sector to the industry. So it seems that the region has been blessed not just with oil and gas, but also with all of the things that are required for green energy, possibly with the exception of water.
Well, that might be true. I'll come back to maybe a point Tom and maybe Paul made just to build off of something they mentioned. I know the general public and maybe the politicians have a certain perception. I think we talked about, when we were talking earlier, about how our industry doesn't have a strong voice. Right. So I don't think we do a very good job of countering the arguments. I know they accuse us of greenwashing. I think, in fact, we're being falsely brownwashed. I think the perception of the general public, the politicians, and indeed maybe the bankers, sorry, Paul, the fact that the renewables are so heavily greenwashed is very frustrating, because I think the shallowness at which the renewables are being painted as the green alternative to fossils doesn't make sense if you scratch beneath the surface and really look at what does it take to mine those minerals, or what does it take to dispose of the finished products, whether it's the solar panels or the batteries from the electric vehicles. I think that aspect is absolutely discarded, whether it's because of the monopoly the media has on what messages they want the general public to see. And I think those messages are very negative on our industry, despite the fact that we have heard over the past couple of days that we're an enabler. I think organizations like the GPCA has done a fundamental job and a phenomenal job trying to get that voice across. But the fact is, we don't have the outreach that most of the media, which is controlled by various other forces, is not allowing that voice to percolate down to the general public. And I think that's a major concern that we have. I think in the region, we're doing what we can to use, as you said, the resources that we have, whether it's building solar panels and renewable facilities to take advantage and do, again, what makes sense, because I don't think it has to make sense at the end of the day.
It's always back down to the economics. So I think the GPCA does a fantastic job. This forum is enlightening on all of the initiatives that are going ahead, but we're preaching to ourselves.
Yes, preaching to the converted.
We are very much preaching to the converted. And Tom, you were talking earlier about vocal local opposition to what are essentially good projects. So we need to get a voice somehow to overcome that.
Yes, we do. And I think, I was encouraged by the opening comments from the president of COP28 last week, a couple of days ago, just reminding people that the simplistic message that says just get rid of hydrocarbons doesn't work. Unless you want to live in a cave, it doesn't work. So the message is much more complex, and it's a mixed economy. I mean, we're investing heavily in renewables at the moment. We're investing in hydrogen significantly, and we're investing in carbon capture because we believe you need both of those tracks to make this work. And I don't think people understand that well enough, and we have more work to do to convince them of it.
Well, that's one of the problems, that it's actually multifaceted. There are so many aspects. There's no just one solution to reducing emissions. It has to be carbon capture, it has to be scope 1, scope 2. It's many, many different things.
Absolutely, and I think this is one thing that the US has got really right with the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, it's actually an agnostic approach to reducing emissions. You know, if you are doing something that is going to reduce carbon, we're going to support you. And that's a really simple message that works well. So we're not going to get hung up, and this is a big problem in Europe right now. We're not going to get hung up because, well, we don't really like carbon capture because you've still got hydrocarbons, or we don't really like nuclear because, well, it's nuclear. You know, that's crazy. That's crazy. If it's reducing emissions, then we should be doing it. And you know, the more the merrier in this sense.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And those are all the actions that are required. But the industry is still, it has a great safety culture, very good safety culture. But that's kind of produced a rather risk-averse nature, and that's potentially spills over into the investment environment and the M&A environment, making this difficult to solve. But M&A maybe is potentially, again, one of the many solutions towards lowering emissions by letting people do it better.
I'll maybe just make a comment on that point. Is it a risk-averse culture? I actually think, in its own way, the chemical sector is, and I'm sure you'll agree, Richard, actually very creative, right? And inclined to risk. These companies are run by scientists and engineers who love to tinker with technology and invent new things. So, you know, look at in my client base in the U.S., Eastman Chemical is making a big bet on molecular recycling and investing hundreds of millions of dollars in a plant in Tennessee, and then another one coming in France. And every one of my clients in the U.S. has major initiatives. Dow announced a big one last week, $6.5 billion to decarbonize and electrify one of their big crackers in Saskatchewan, right? So that's a lot of technology and bringing to bear to make that transition happen. And I think these companies, and I wouldn't exclude companies in the region here, are really using all that creativity to solve these issues. I do think there's an increasing recognition on the part of the investment community that the solutions do lie within the companies. We can't just shut it off. We can't shut off energy. We can't shut off polymers. And so the right way to look at these things is start at a given point and the carbon emissions that a company was generating, and look at the improvements they make. Not necessarily by divesting, but the organic improvements that they make to reduce their carbon footprint over time and develop technologies. It's going to take time, but the solution lies within the companies, in my view.
I think building on that and coming to your comment about our focus on health and safety, I actually see that as a benefit in this environment, because what we've developed in this industry over the last 40 or 50 years is an incredibly disciplined approach to managing risk. That's what our health and safety approach is. And we are the best industry in the world by miles at what we do. And those same disciplines apply in ESG. That is about long-term managed risk, and I think we can do that really, really well. So I think it's possibly an advantage rather than disadvantage for us.
Absolutely. Nadia, would you see that?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. No, it always amazes me that in our industry, safety is so paramount, and then you go home and people take off all the PPE and do DIY. It's crazy. I see we have some questions from the audience, which I'd like to turn to. So we see one here. Other than the major players, do you consider engaging with smaller entities in terms of M&A, and what would drive that for a strategic approach?
Yes is the short answer, I think, to that. What drives the strategic approach for me is technology. So we have ventured with a number of small SMEs to look for technology, particularly in the area of circular economy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because obviously there's great ideas happening everywhere, but they won't necessarily have the capital to be able to develop it.
Right.
I think we've looked at the key factors contributing to mergers and acquisitions. The bottom one there, how do you see M&A in a recycling industry to support circular feedstock?
I mean, just that's fundamentally what I just mentioned. That, you know, I think it's extremely. There's a lot of creativity going on out there around circularity, and we see M&A as a really good way of bringing that into the mainstream of the industry.
Yeah, I think we've largely covered the other questions there. So, one final thought. Tom, what have you learned from investing in elite sports?
That it's much harder than chemicals. There's a lot more variables and a lot more things go wrong. No, I mean, I think we've invested in elite sport because we're increasingly growing a consumer profile business.
Yeah.
So we actually have an automotive business, we have a fashion business, believe it or not, and we have a household products division now as well. So it's a way of growing our name. We used to be the biggest company you've never heard of.
Yes.
And we don't want that to continue when you're trying to sell to consumers. So that's been its biggest benefit.
Okay. Well, but that's actually very interesting, because that brings us back to the point of advocacy, that we're not known by the consumers. The American Chemistry Council has tried very hard, historically it's advertised for us, but actually this is a very good point, that actually it's a way of chemical companies and energy companies reaching audiences.
Yeah. It also has a downside challenge that you get accused of greenwashing all the time.
Right.
So we have to convince people that's not the case.
That's great. Great. Well, thank you very much. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, some real insight. And I think, as we've seen, M&A is definitely part of the solution, as is many other things with technology, ways of getting to a lower emissions means of producing the wonderful products that we do produce. So please join me in thanking our panel.